My name is Mara Quinn, and at 26 I've just clipped my hospital badge to a Navy scrub top for the first time. The badge is new. The stethoscope in my drawer is not. It belonged to my mother Elena, who used to kneel so we were eye level and let me press the diaphragm to the hollow at her collarbone. That's what steady sounds like, she'd say. I didn't understand how much work steadiness took until she was gone. We lived in a second-floor walk-up on Oak Street, a brick building that hummed with the sound of someone else's radio. Our apartment was small enough that the smell of my mother's night shift coffee met you at the door. She was an LPN at a county clinic, the kind of nurse who came home with tape marks on her wrists, and stories she'd softened for me, how a frightened patient calmed when she braided the woman's hair. How a doctor muttered thank you without looking up and it still mattered. On Saturdays we baked in a dented muffin tin we inherited from a neighbor. I measured flour with a butter knife the way she taught me, and we announced each ingredient like a game show. On Sundays, we walked to the library and let the heavy doors exhale cool air over us. She always chose something practical, gardening in containers, healthy soups on a budget, and I checked out animal encyclopedias. Learn all you can, she'd say as we crossed the parking lot, because no one can repossess your mind. She bought me a toy medical kit for my 10th birthday plastic otoscope thermometer that never climbed above 98.6, a bandage roll too narrow for anything. I wore the Red Cross bag across my chest like a sash and recorded the vital signs of stuffed animals. It was pretend and it was rehearsal, and I couldn't have told you where one ended. The year I turned 12, fatigue moved into our apartment like a third tenant. At first, my mother blamed the double shifts. She'd wake with a cough that sounded like metal tapping glass and wave it away. Then she started pushing dinner around her plate and insisting she'd eaten at work. The dented muffin tin collected dust on top of the fridge. When I offered to make oatmeal, she let me. The diagnosis did not arrive all at once. There were weeks of probably bronchitis, and then a shadow on an X-ray, and then words that rearranged the room stage 4. A pamphlet my mother tried to keep in her purse flashed like a fish-scale glossy photos of people holding hands in gardens. We did not have a garden. We had linoleum that needed scrubbing, and a narrow bathtub and a neighbor, Mrs. Ortiz, who started leaving containers of arroz con pollo on our doormat. I learned the ritual of medication bottles sort the amber ones from the white count, the pills circle the times on an index card. I learned how to wedge my shoulder under my mother's arm so she could stand without using her ribs. I set a chair in the kitchen so she could rest between steps from the stove to the sink. I learned to recognize good days and bad by the weight of her breath. School receded. I kept up just enough to fool attendance letters. Teachers wrote notes in margins, bright, capable words that felt like paper medals. After classes, I went home straight away. I vacuumed until the vacuum burned dust and made the living room smell like an electric storm. I watered the spider plant my mother loved because it sent out new shoots that looked like courage. When hospice came, the nurse's hands were kind and her tote was organized. She showed me how to crush tablets into applesauce, how to tilt a straw so a dry mouth could accept it. "You're a quick study," she said, and I wanted to tell her I'd been studying for years. One morning in late spring, after my 13th birthday, my mother fell asleep with my palm under her cheek and did not wake. The hospice nurse found us when she arrived for her visit. I'd never been colder in my life than I was in that warm room. The funeral was a blur of pressed black and voices that softened when people looked at me. My grandmother's hands shook too much to sign papers, and the social worker spoke in a voice that was equal parts apology and procedure. My mother had a sister, Valerie. They hadn't been close, but the social worker called her, and Valerie arrived at the chapel in a dove-gray blouse, her hair pinned into something architectural. She placed a steady hand on my shoulder, as if she'd practiced the gesture, and repeated it for the room. "Of course she'll come with us." They lived 200 miles away in a suburb with curbs so neat the grass looked digitized. Tom, Valerie's husband, was a project manager who used words like deliverable at the dinner table. Their daughter Riley was 15 and had a room that looked like a magazine spread, string lights, a vanity mirror rimmed with bulbs, a jewelry tree with branches like fingers. My room was at the back of the house near the laundry, painted the color of primer, and furnished with a futon that popped when I sat down. "We'll get you settled," Valerie said, as if the room and I were both temporary. The first week tasted like someone else's toothpaste. Valerie wrote house rules on a whiteboard by the pantry. Under my name, she listed dishes nightly bathroom on even hours only curfew at 9, quiet after 10. Under Riley's name, AP Chem Dance lacks practice a heart. We all contribute, Valerie said, handing me a sponge like a baton. She leaned on the word we until it bent. Every time money passed through the house, it made a sound. Riley's laptop arrived in a box big enough for a child to hide in. The packing paper drifted across the living room like a snowfall. I was taken to a discount outlet and told to choose 2 pairs of jeans and sensible shoes. When school supply lists came home, Riley unfurled a backpack with hidden compartments, and I received a grocery bag with college-ruled paper, 2 pencils and a calculator that clicked like a cash register. We're being careful, Valerie said. Your mother didn't leave. Arrangements. I learned the grammar of that pause. It meant we will say generosity out loud and record subtraction in private. Tom was gentle in a quiet way. He asked if I needed rides if I was keeping up in classes. He did not correct Valerie when she narrowed the thermostat or counted slices of deli meat at dinner. Riley was adept at soft warfare. She never insulted me directly. She just told stories in a tone that used me as a backdrop. My cousin is staying with us for a while, she'd say to her friends on the phone, and it's like a lot. The word cousin sounded like clutter. School meant a new uniform and a guidance counselor who skimmed my file and placed me in standard courses so you're not overloaded. I wanted to argue myself up into the honors track, but the first week I discovered you can't negotiate when you're exhausted down to the marrow. The biology teacher's room held a skeleton that watched me concentrate. I finished worksheets early and asked for more. Ambitious, the teacher wrote in blue pen, and I tucked the paper into a folder as carefully as if it were fragile glass. I found relief in the library. The hum, the smell of dust warmed by light, the feeling that so long as you sat quietly and turned pages, no one was owed anything. I took home books about the heart, because I wanted to understand how something that thudded so reliably in your chest could develop a betrayal. I made flashcards and hid them inside the paperback I carried to avoid conversations in the hallways. Valerie insisted on family dinners when calendars allowed. She was a natural interviewer. How was your day, she'd ask, and the question came with the correct answer. Good, productive, grateful. If I mentioned needing shoes for gym or money for a field trip, a ledger opened behind her eyes. We'll see what we can do, she'd say, and I'd feel the math of my presence clattering in her head. Teenagers are expensive, she told Tom as if I were not there. It's a lot to absorb. Absorb was a word that turned into an invoice even before I knew how big the bill would become. In the 3rd month, I helped clean the garage. Valerie liked clear tubs with labels, a taxonomy of household life winter scarves. Cords seasonal, I carried a bin labeled papers to the kitchen table and began sorting. There were warranties for appliances, tax documents with pink flags, Riley's camp forms. Beneath those was an envelope addressed to Valerie Jensen, representative payee for minor. The return address block printed Social Security Administration. The paper was official white, the kind you could hear when you shook it. I did not open it. I read what showed through the window, a line about benefits and deposit dates, and a date that overlapped with the month after my mother's funeral. I knew only the edges of how those things worked. I knew that the hospice nurse had said there were programs that a social worker had patted my shoulder and told me to bring any mail with the government seal to my guardian. I slid the envelope back under the pile and felt something in me align like a picture straightened on a wall. Valerie had told me again and again that every extra apple I put on my plate cost her, that my laundry used detergent, they had to budget for that new socks were luxuries. Yet here was a document with numbers meant for the person taking care of me. I pictured the ledgers in her head, the whiteboard on the pantry, the way she tapped the refrigerator door to signal that it had been open too long. I thought of Riley's laptop box and the cheap calculator that clicked like disapproval. That night, when Valerie announced good-naturedly that the electricity bill had jumped and we would need to be especially mindful, I wiped the counter slower than usual and kept my face so still my cheeks ached. I was not clever or brave. I was tired and precise. After everyone went to bed, I took a notebook from my backpack and wrote down the date on the envelope I had not opened and the words I'd been able to read through the plastic window and a question mark. It felt like placing a pin on a map. I did not know the whole route yet. I knew only that there was one. The next afternoon, I stopped by the library on my way home under the pretense of returning a book. In the corner with the bulletin boards where tutors thumbtacked business cards, there was a pamphlet about benefits for children who had lost a parent. I tucked it into my folder. On the walk back, I passed a girl pushing a stroller. The baby inside laughed as if the world were a friend. I had the sudden absurd urge to tell that baby about spreadsheets. Instead, I went home. I set the table with 4 plates, 4 forks, 4 cups. I folded napkins into rectangles. I waited for water to boil for pasta and stared at the steam until it disappeared. Later, when the mail slot clacked and a stack slid to the hall rug, I carried it in and set it on the entry table. I sorted junk from bills, flyers, from catalogs. When I came to another SSA envelope addressed the same way, I stacked it under the cable invoice so the corner of its window didn't show. Then I turned off the hallway light and went to finish the dishes, the sponge a small weight in my palm. The sink made a sound like rain. I lowered my head so the steam could fog my glasses and blur the room. In the glass, my face looked like it belonged to an older girl. In the next room, the dryer clicked to a stop. I pulled my notebook toward me and wrote down another date. I did not make plans. I did not speak. I kept track. I kept the notebook close and my mouth closed. Dates, fragments, the language on windows of envelopes, each line a small anchor in a shifting room. It made school feel less like an interruption and more like a shelter I could carry. By October, the mornings had gone glass cold. I began waking up early to claim the bathroom on my even hour, then sat at the kitchen table with my flashcards while the house was still quiet. When Valerie came down, she'd click on the pendant light and say pleasantly, "Up already, good habits." On the whiteboard, she added Laundry Wednesday beneath my name and wrote Riley, Homecoming Corsage beneath my cousin's. The list looked balanced until you noticed how the weight was distributed. At school, I asked the guidance office to review my placement tests. The counselor skimmed a screen and smiled in a way that said no. "You've had a hard year," she said. "Let's focus on stability." I went to my biology teacher instead. Ms. Keene wore her hair up in a pencil and labeled the classroom skeleton Thurgood. She looked at the quizzes I'd finished in half the allotted time and signed a form with no ceremony, the kind that changes your day without changing your face. "You'll do fine," she said, sliding the paper back. "Just don't let other people's caution become your ceiling." After classes, I started spending an hour in the library and another in the science wing when there was something to set up or put away. The custodian gave me an old key on a lanyard, and I used it like a passport. When I got home, I kept my head down, washed whatever dishes had collected, and wrote in the notebook only after I was sure the house had settled. Twice that month, mail from the Social Security Administration arrived. Twice I noted the dates and the phrasing I could see through the plastic window. I resumed breathing, as if it were a task to be checked off. In November, I took a weekend job at Larkspur Bakehouse, a narrow shop that smelled like butter citrus, and the relief of counting exact change. The owner, Ana Morales, taught me to slide a serrated knife like a violin bow and to double wrap baguettes when the air turned dry. "You're careful," she said, watching me fold parchment around a cake. Careful was praise I could wear. On my second payday, I set a crisp stack of bills on the counter at home. Valerie looked pleased in a way that made my skin prickle. "We should talk about contribution," she said. "Room and board aren't abstract." The amount she named, $250, sounded reasonable until I thought about bus fare and lab fees, until I saw how much emptier the envelope looked with her finger still on it. I said yes, because no always costs more. Winter slid in quietly. Riley's friends drifted through on weekends, leaving clouds of perfume and anecdotes meant to be overheard. "It's like living with a tenant," Riley told someone on speaker, as she painted her nails, and I felt the word press against my ribs from the inside. Tom asked once if I was warm enough at night. Eyes kind in a way that never traveled to his voice. Valerie stocked the pantry with box mixes and wrote milk gallon on the whiteboard with a question mark that stood for me. There are days that change you without leaving a mark. Then there was the afternoon I went looking for a stapler and opened the lower drawer in Tom's office. He kept everything squared neat, as a blueprint printer paper and Reams pens, aligned in a tray file folders, labeled with a level of care that suggested he liked what could be contained. One read, Mara Guardianship. My name in his caps startled me enough that I sat down. Inside, there were letters with the SSA's Helix logo and deposit notices with dates that matched the ones in my notebook. There were photocopies of checks from an insurer I didn't recognize, amounts whose commas made my stomach rattle. I didn't take anything. I used my phone to photograph each page against the desk's wood grain, then emailed the images to my school address with subject lines that looked like grocery lists. When I slid the folder back, I aligned the edges with the desk and breathed until my hands stopped chattering. I didn't know what to do with evidence except make sure it existed. The year rounded a corner. I added Health Science Club to my Tuesdays, then asked Ms. Keene for a recommendation letter because asking her felt like stepping onto sturdy ground. She wrote it fast and folded it the way you fold good news. Anna at the bakery gave me a sticky note with the name of a nurse at St. Raphael Clinic who took volunteers on Sundays to restock supplies and assemble care kits for discharge. I wore the clinic's paper badge like a costume that fit me better than my clothes. On the bus back, I pressed my forehead to the window and let the city's lights smear into one line I could follow. Spring skated in lightly, and then graduation season arrived with rental gowns and laughter that bounced around the gym. I walked across a stage while Valerie and Tom claimed traffic as the reason they missed it. In the back row, I heard someone cheer, and when I looked up, Anna was lifting her phone to take a crooked picture. After the ceremony, she handed me a small box with a ribbon that had been tied twice to be sure. Inside was a fountain pen in a color called blackberry, dark enough to look serious and warm enough to pass for joy. "For your next set of forms," she said. I laughed because she was right. Letters bloomed in the mailbox that summer. Valerie started sorting them before I got home, which would have mattered more if she understood the speed of an early bus and the way a route can be altered by a single block. One afternoon, a heavy envelope arrived stamped with the crest of Redwood State University, and I felt its weight through the slot. I carried it upstairs against my chest and hid in the laundry room where the hum made the house vibrate. The letter used words I had only whispered to myself full tuition housing book stipend merit. I read it twice, then slid it between my mattress and the slat. When Valerie later set a small pile of mail on my plate, a dental reminder, a coupon book, a church flyer, I ate around it. The last weeks in that house felt like the way you stand while the dentist takes an x-ray, still jaw-braced to film against your tongue. Valerie didn't argue about college when I showed her the award letter. She did say, "You'll need a storage solution for your things over winter break," as if I were bringing home a piano. I packed my life into 2 suitcases easily enough. On move-in day, she pulled to the curb of North Hall, tapped the hazard lights, and said, "Text when you're settled." Tom opened the trunk so I could lift out the second bag. Riley didn't look up from her screen. I waved because that's the kind of person I am. The car's blinker ticked, then slid away. My roommate, Nia Delgado, arrived with a laughing aunt and a father who measured the window to hang a tension rod for curtains. They offered me a strip of twinkle lights and the cinnamon roll they'd brought for an energy boost. "We always overpack," Nia's aunt said, transferring packets of herbal tea into my hands as if she were dealing cards. That night, Nia called her mom and said she's nice, you'd like her, and I turned toward the wall because I wasn't ready for kindness head on. College shrank and expanded at the same time. Redwood State's campus had maples that flamed red in October and a learning commons that stayed open past midnight. The School of Nursing ran drills in a simulation suite where mannequins blinked and bled politely, and my schedule stitched itself together with labs pharmacology and early clinical shifts that made dawn feel like a door I knew the code for. I picked up hours at the campus cafe pouring espresso for people who used office hours like oxygen. I learned the shortcut from anatomy to pathophysiology and the trick of memorizing drug classes by pinning them to the rhythm of my walk. Valerie began treating breaks as invoices. Before Thanksgiving, she called and said, "We need to discuss what's fair if you're staying here the whole week." Groceries are not theoretical. I mentioned the cafe shifts I could pick up instead, and then hung up and stared at my hands until they stopped tingling. Nia's father overheard me mention the call and said, "We're going to my sister's for the holiday. She cooks enough for an army. Come." I walked into a house that smelled like cumin and orange peel and left with containers that fed me through finals. I built a life on the small economies of kindness. On Fridays, Ms. Keene, now just Ruth in my phone, texted to ask how I liked my professors, and whether she should send a box of old lab goggles for decoration. At the clinic, I moved from stuffing discharge bags to shadowing the triage nurse on slow Sundays, watching how she listened for what patients didn't say. In the cafe, a third-year medical student lingered after a volunteer fare table. He had the sort of careful face that went kinder when he concentrated. He read the child health flyer I'd taped to the wall and asked, "Is that your event?" I said. "Our event, because credit and work both prefer plurals." His name was Evan Hart. We drank burnt coffee and compared notes on public clinics on whether rural meant far or forgotten, and I realized I didn't always need to make myself smaller to fit a conversation. The second spring, I decided to visit Student Legal Services. Their office was in a building that used to be a bank. The waiting room still had a vault door that someone had decided to keep open for charm. A law student named Priya took notes while I told her a condensed version of what I had dates. Envelopes, the photographs I'd emailed myself and then printed at the library in quiet hours when the printer sounded like something speaking. Priya's supervising attorney flipped through the copies and tapped a paragraph with his pen. "Representative payees are obligated to use benefits for the beneficiary's needs," he said. "If you suspect misuse documentation is exactly what you should be doing, you also need to take care of yourself. Statutes of limitation are a thing. You don't have to decide anything this minute." I walked out lighter, as if the building had an internal weather that made air easier to carry. The years organized themselves into semesters and rotations. I learned muscle memory glove snap chart entries, the gravity of a small patient's hand grasping your finger, because gravity can be measured in something other than units. Evan and I met between classes when schedules allowed. He drove an old hatchback that only started if you turned the key with conviction. Nia and I grew a basil plant in a chipped mug and failed twice before we stopped overwatering it. When I had to choose a practicum, I chose pediatric intensive care because walking into a room where you could make someone's pain 2 points lower felt like a kind of math I wanted to be good at. On a day in late April, my email chimed with a message from the Children's Pavilion at Mercy Grove Hospital. The subject line had all the words I had taped to a wall in my head off for pediatric ICU new graduate. I read it twice, then blinked until the screen stopped shimmering. Nia spun in her chair when I told her and pulled me into a hug that lifted both of us off the floor. Evan grinned so hard he looked like he'd swallowed a light. I bought a cupcake from the cafe and ate it with a fork as if it were an age. 2 weeks later, on a bench beside the campus lake, where the path gravel sounded like applause underfoot, Evan untied a small square box. The ring inside had a blue stone set low in a simple band, old enough to have a story. He said fewer words than I would have expected, and none of them were wasted. I said yes in ordinary volume, and the ducks on the lake didn't even startle, which felt exactly right. Graduation day came bright, and certain the sky a hard, good blue. Nia bobby-pinned my cap while I ironed a crease into my gown with the flat of my palm. Outside Simmons Auditorium, the Delgados arrived with flowers wrapped in brown paper, and Evan's parents handed me a new white lab coat with Mara Quinn RN stitched in navy on the pocket. I slid my arms into it and felt the fabric settle on my shoulders like the kind of weight you want. We took photos in front of the maples and then joined the line snaking toward the doors. I saw them before they saw me. Valerie in a cream jacket that photographed well. Tom checking his watch, as if punctuality were a personality trait. Riley wearing sunglasses, though we were in the shade. Valerie's smile was public and practiced. "There she is," she called. Lifting a hand as if she were flagging a server, she kissed my cheek without touching my skin and said, "We wouldn't miss our Mara's big moment." The pronoun landed with the precision of a dart. Inside speeches floated over us like something projected on the ceiling. When my name was called, the room sounded like a field of crickets, and then like thunder. I felt the stage under my shoes, and the thin paper in my hand, and the strap of my mother's stethoscope, a small weight inside my bag, remind me of what had steadied me before any of this. After the cap throw and the hug swarm and the taking of too many photos to be about faces anymore, we spilled back toward the lawn where tables held sweating pitchers of lemonade. Valerie intercepted me with a firmness that looked like affection. "A gift," she said, pressing a thick envelope into my palm. Her stationery was engraved VJ in a font that suggested decisions. "Open it," she said, voice bright enough to carry. Around us, families posed with bouquets and balloons bumped elbows. The first page wasn't a card. It was a statement formatted like a bill expenses incurred in the care of minor 2012-2017. Line items marched in tidy columns. Room and board utilities, transportation medical miscellaneous. Totals were circled in red ink, as if emphasis could legislate truth. At the bottom, the number was written both in digits and words, $50,000, $50,000. "What is this?" I said, because a question can be both sentence and temperature. "A record," Valerie replied. "We supported you for 5 years. Now that you have a profession, it's appropriate to make this right." Her smile thinned, but she kept it on. I looked at the number until it blurred. I looked up. "There were benefits," I said. "Deposits made for my care every month. Insurance. Other funds." I did not say how I knew. I did not mention the folder or the photographs or the notebook I'd filled dark with dates. Barely covered groceries. Valerie said, the shape of her mouth unchanged. "You've always been expensive, Mara. We did what family does." Evan had been talking with his parents a few yards away. He stepped closer now, not looming, just present in a way that reminded me I wasn't alone in this frame. Tom shifted. Riley adjusted her sunglasses, and the sun found the lens at an angle that hid her eyes completely. I slid the paper back into its envelope and placed it very gently on the table beside the lemonade. I didn't yell. I didn't explain the specific words on the SSA envelopes or the policy documents with numbers that didn't smell like milk or electricity. I said, "I'm not paying this," and the steadiness in my voice surprised me. "Please don't contact me about it again." Valerie's mouth held the smile, but her eyes sharpened. "We'll be in touch," she said. If she had added, "Dear," it would have sounded like a closing. We left then, because there were other people to hug, and the light was going soft, and because the day had already been asked to hold more than its share of weight. That night, our apartment full of people who had set chairs out on the balcony and passed around takeout containers like communion plates, I slipped into the bedroom to hang up my new lab coat. The embroidered name looked like a promise in thread. 3 days later, a letter arrived at my mailbox with an address I didn't recognize, printed in tasteful sans serif Hollis, Danvers, and Rowe, LLP. The subject line through the envelope window read, "Demand for payment." I stood very still in the hallway, where the light is always a little blue. A neighbor's dog barked on the floor below. The sound bounced up the stairwell and softened as it rose. I carried the letter to the table and set it down, then pulled the notebook toward me and wrote the date in the margin where the paper curls. I picked up the envelope again and ran a finger along the sealed flap. When I opened it, the paper made a small, exact sound. The letter from Hollis, Danvers, and Rowe was printed on paper that pretended to be expensive. I read it at the kitchen table with my hands flat on either side, as if the page could run. They demanded $50,000 for care and support, rendered with a deadline that looked official because it aligned perfectly with the margin. I walked the letter across campus to Student Legal Services and handed it to Priya. She read silently, mouth tightening a fraction. "You've been documenting?" she asked. I slid over my notebook and the stack of printed photos I'd taken of the folder in Tom's desk. Priya paged through, then said, "This is beyond our scope for representation, but I can refer you." She scribbled a name, Lena Whitlow-esque. "She does clean work. Bring everything." Whitlow's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled like copier, toner, and old carpet. Her reception area was a square of calm. The clock ticked in a way that measured confidence. She was in her 40s, hair pulled back jacket, unflashy and well cut. She didn't perform outrage when I told her what Valerie had done. She pushed the demand letter aside and asked for a timeline. I gave her dates until my throat felt like paper. "You did the single most useful thing Whitlow said when I finished. You wrote it down." She tapped the notebook. "We'll respond with a denial file, a counterclaim, and move into discovery. I'll need releases for bank statements, the representative payee records from SSA, any insurance payout documents, and proof of any inheritance. If they balk, the court can compel." She glanced at the demand letter again. "Do not speak to them directly. Forward everything here." I left the office with an intake packet and the sort of relief that makes your shoulders hurt when it eases. Evan met me outside, hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't ask what we would do, he asked where I wanted to walk. We traced the path around the lake, and I told him about Whitlow's list. "Good," he said. "Let's get you a sandwich." While Whitlow drafted her reply, my days learned a double exposure hospital orientation on top of legal preparation. In the morning, I shadowed nurses through head-to-toe assessments, our voices low around sleeping children. In the afternoon, I scanned PDFs and signed authorizations. Nia put labels on the manila folders because labeling is a way of saying we are not lost. Anna sent boxes from Larkspur with pastries and tucked between croissants index cards that said, "You are steady in her looping hand." Opposing counsel answered by offering a reduced settlement, $30,000 if I paid within 60 days. Whitlow's response was 3 sentences long. The next envelope she handed me was heavy with bank statements, 5 years of deposits highlighted in yellow, whenever the memo line read, "SSA beneficiary, Mara Quinn." Whitlow had also obtained a copy of a life insurance disbursement my mother had named for the benefit of her minor child, and a note from the insurer advising those funds be held in trust. There was a modest inheritance from my mother's parents, small but as clear as a streetlight in fog. Whitlow's paralegal. Owen built a spreadsheet with columns for date, amount, and account. The pattern was plain monthly government deposits into an account Valerie controlled, a lump sum insurance payment, the inheritance check. The outgoing transactions were groceries and utilities, yes, but also boutique purchases, club fees, a down payment on a newer car registered to Tom Home Upgrades that matched the month Valerie redid the kitchen backsplash. My name did not appear on a single purchase for Brace's tutoring, or even the school field trip I'd skipped because it wasn't a good time. Commingling, Whitlow said, marking the statements. "No separation, no proof of benefit. We'll ask for their receipts. I don't expect them to have what they claim." She looked up. "This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about what the law requires a guardian to do." The deposition felt like a bad dress rehearsal. Valerie's attorney asked me whether I was grateful and if I understood how much stress a teenager adds to a household budget. "Answer only the question," Whitlow murmured, and I did yes. "No, I don't recall the record will reflect." When it was Whitlow's turn, she placed the SSA records on the table one at a time, like cards you don't have to bluff with. "Can you explain?" She asked Valerie how a payment designated for Mara's care appears the same week as a withdrawal at Sable & Koyu. "Jewelers," Valerie said it was a gift, and then looked at her lawyer as if gifts had legal definitions. A week later, the court set a date. The county courthouse had ceilings that made everyone a little quieter. I arrived early because early was the only control I had. Ruth Keene sat in the back row with a tote bag that looked like it could carry a lab. Anna was beside her, a small box on her lap wrapped with bakery string. Nia took my hand and squeezed once the way you do when you're measuring if something is solid. Evan stood at the aisle end, shoulders squared, as if he'd been assigned to hold up a wall. Opposite us, Valerie wore a cream suit that paired well with condemnation. Tom studied a leaf of paperwork like it might produce instructions. Riley was a whisper of perfume and a pair of sunglasses pushed into her hair like a crown. Their attorney, Mr. Kelleher, smoothed his tie the way some people reset their faces. Marshall V. Quinn. "Petition for reimbursement," the clerk called. Judge Nora Patel took the bench movement's efficient, eyes steady. She looked at the docket, then at us, counsel. Kelleher went first. He spun a story about sacrifice that had been polished for daylight. He used words like substantial burden and equity. He held up Valerie's invoice and shook it slightly so the paper made sound. "My client provided food, shelter, clothing, educational support, and the stability of a family home," he said, pacing a step and a half. Now that Ms. Quinn has achieved professional standing, she should reasonably contribute to the extraordinary expenses borne on her behalf. Whitlow did not pace. She stood where she could see the judge and me in the same sightline. "Your Honor," she said, "this case is not about gratitude. It is about fiduciary duty. The petitioner was representative payee for federal survivor benefits, paid for the benefit of a minor child. She also received funds from a life insurance policy specifically for that minor and a small inheritance. The total exceeds $180,000. The record will show that these monies were commingled, spent without accounting, and did not result in the care claimed. Judge Patel's pen paused. You have documentation. Yes, Whitlow said, and Owen rose to hand over binder's tabs and colors that made the point without drama. They called Valerie first. Kelleher guided her through a script: the spare bedroom, the extra seat at the table, the vacations curtailed. When he asked about the SSA deposits, she said they barely covered food. Whitlow's cross was a spool unwinding. Mrs. Jensen Whitlow said, please turn to the bank statement for March of 2014. Valerie flipped hands steady. Do you see the deposit labeled SSA beneficiary Mara Quinn for $1.230? Yes. 3 days later, a debit to Bellevue Club and Dance for $480. Was that Mara's activity? No. 4 days after the deposit, a purchase at Sable & Co. for $16. Was that Mara's expense? It was a gift. A gift for whom? Silence took a seat beside us. Whitlow moved methodically the insurance disbursement that had gone into the same household account, the inheritance that never reached a trust, the lack of braces, the rent Valerie collected from my part-time wages, the whiteboard where my chores had been itemized neatly next to Riley's dance schedule. She did not ask me if I was grateful. She did not ask Valerie if she was sorry. When I took the stand, I kept my answers as narrow as a hallway. I told the judge what I had done, not what I wished. I described the envelopes with windows, the dates copied in ink at a kitchen table, the folder in Tom's desk I had photographed page by page. Kelleher tried to turn me toward sentiment. You were taken in, he said, voice careful. They spared you foster care. Whitlow objected. Sustained, Judge Patel said, and Kelleher moved on. After the testimony, the courtroom hummed the way rooms hum when people lower their voices without reducing their opinions. Judge Patel took a recess long enough for me to notice the pattern in the carpet, and then returned with her glasses pushed lower on her nose. I have reviewed the submission, she said. The petition for reimbursement is denied. She lifted a hand a fraction when Kelleher inhaled to speak, with prejudice. The two words landed with a finality that erased the white space between them. She continued, voice even. The record shows that the petitioner, acting as representative payee and guardian, received funds designated for the minor's benefit and failed to account for their use. The court notes commingling of funds and expenditures unrelated to the minor's care. This matter is referred to the county attorney and the Office of Inspector General for the Social Security Administration for review of potential misuse. Ms. Quinn retains the right to pursue civil recovery. Judge Patel closed the file not as performance but as punctuation. We are adjourned. Chairs scraped. Papers sighed back into briefcases. Valerie remained standing a beat too long, as if she had rehearsed a different ending and was waiting for it to arrive. Tom's shoulders collapsed inward like an umbrella failing. Riley looked down, and for the first time her sunglasses did what they were made to do: hide. Outside, the morning had tilted toward noon. The courthouse steps were shallow and wide. People drifted like a slow current. Ruth pressed a cool bottle of water into my hand. Anna tied the bakery string around my wrist like a temporary bracelet. Nia hugged me with both arms, and half her resolve then stepped back to breathe. Evan brushed his knuckles over mine, a touch light enough to register and firm enough to steady. Whitlow slid a copy of the order into a folder and handed it to me. This is yours, she said. I'll follow up when the referrals convert to case numbers. Her voice didn't add weight where there wasn't any. Get some lunch. I nodded. The file felt heavier than paper and lighter than stones. We started down the steps together. A gust of wind lifted the corner of the order, and I held it flat with my palm until the page settled. We walked to a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse where the ice water came in thick glasses and the fries were salted like they meant it. No toasts, no speeches. We ate. When the check came, Anna slid her bakery string from my wrist, tied it around the receipt, and said, for the file. It made me laugh in a way that let my lungs work again. That evening, after the apartment emptied of congratulations and paper plates, a text arrived from a number I knew without saving. This isn't how family behaves. I stared until the screen dimmed, and then almost gently blocked the contact. The room felt larger by half an inch. The next morning, I put on scrubs the color of deep water and clipped my badge to the pocket with my name stitched beneath RN. Mercy Grove Children's Pavilion woke early monitors speaking in careful tones, the smell of antiseptic threaded with bubblegum flavoring from a medication room. Charge nurse Karen walked me through the unit with a voice that never hurried. I learned which machines beeped because they needed attention and which beeped because they were alive. A boy with a stitched bear asked if I was the new Mara, as if the hospital handed out replacements. I said, just Mara, and he offered the bear's paw for a handshake. Work reordered the day. Assessments lines charting the small choreography of getting a child to accept a sip of water without making it feel like a test. In the break room, someone always left a bag of mandarin oranges and a magazine with recipes no one would ever have time to make. I kept my mother's stethoscope in my locker looped over a hook. On lunch breaks, I touched the rubber tubing with 2 fingers and felt steadier than I could explain. A week after the hearing, Tom called. He sounded like a man listening to his own words from a distance. I should have known more, he said. I should have done more. The apology was small and finished. It didn't come with a request. Before we hung up, he added, I moved out. The line clicked quiet. I stood by the kitchen sink and watched a cloud move past the window like a thought that had decided to leave. Paper followed. Whitlow forwarded a note from the county attorney acknowledging the referral. The SSA Office of Inspector General assigned a case number that looked like a row of fence posts. I scanned each page, filed them behind the tab labeled orders, and went to sleep without rehearsing the day in my head. Evan learned my schedule and met me outside the hospital when his allowed it. We'd sit on a low wall near the ambulance bay and split a muffin like a treaty. Once a parade of toddlers in gowns went past, shepherded by a child life specialist with a plastic crown tilted on her hair. They waved as if waving were part of treatment. Evan saluted back with 2 fingers and kept a grin he didn't try to hide. Late summer, a manila envelope arrived from Human Resources at Mercy Grove. I opened it at the counter, expecting onboarding forms I'd already filled out. Inside was a letter printed on heavy stock. A fund has been established in memory of Elena Quinn to support nursing students from single-parent households. The donor has requested you serve on the selection committee if willing. The number at the bottom stopped me $50,000, the same shape as Valerie's invoice written in numbers and in words. Tucked behind the formal letter was a short note from the hospital's counsel confirming the gift came from Thomas Jensen. I took the envelope to Ruth's classroom on her prep period. We sat at a lab table. She turned the paper so the light fell clean. He did this, she asked, not disbelieving, just aligning facts. I nodded. She tapped the corner of the letter once and pushed it back to me. Do you want to help pick the recipients? I did. That was the whole answer. The first meeting was in a small conference room that smelled faintly of dry erase marker and coffee. Files stacked like short towers. I read essays written in the language of effort shifts covered siblings watched courses pass by the width of a pencil. We argued gently about rankings not because anyone was wrong, but because there were more people to help than money. When we chose 3 names, I wrote them on a note card with the pen Anna had given me, the ink the color of blackberries. In September, a padded envelope arrived without a return address. Inside a small velvet box and a note on printer paper. Found these in storage. They're yours. T. The box held my mother's nursing pin brass, warmed by someone else's hand. It wasn't valuable except for the way it tilted the air. I slid it into the inside pocket of my lab coat and left it there weightless and present. There were days that were only days, charting done high fives, traded in the hallway, a plan adjusted quietly at a bedside. There were nights when a monitor went still, and the room held its breath. On one of those nights, as we stood at the nurse's station, after Karen set a paper cup of water in front of me without looking up. You're good at the parts no one teaches, she said, and walked away before I could find an answer. Evan and I were married at the community garden near campus, where the basil grows too fast unless you keep cutting it back. Nia strung borrowed lights between the posts. Anna brought a cake that tasted like citrus and something old-fashioned. Ruth wore a dress with pockets and cried exactly once. We signed our names, and the city went on around us, traffic a soft river at the edges. The Elena Quinn Scholarship funded its first 3 students that year. We met them in a break room at the School of Nursing and ate cookies off napkins while they spoke about schedules and buses and the way time stretches when you're the one everyone depends on. I listened and did not offer advice. I wrote down the dates of their first clinicals and showed them where the good vending machine was. One evening, after a long shift that felt like it had been measured in inches rather than hours, I walked to the cemetery with a bouquet of supermarket flowers wrapped in crinkled cellophane. The air had the first edge of cold. I knelt, brushed leaves from the stone with my palm, and told my mother out loud what my day had been, vitals within range. A laugh coaxed from a kid who hadn't wanted to laugh, a letter sent, confirming next year's scholarship cycle. The words sounded ordinary and exact. On the way home, I stopped at the library and returned a book overdue by 3 days. The building exhaled the same cool air it always had. At the front desk, the librarian waved away the late fee and slid a bookmark across the counter, a strip of card printed with the simplest rule: "Please return by the due date." I smiled because sometimes the instructions are that clear. I slid the bookmark into my bag beside the stethoscope and walked back out into the evening, which had gone blue and kind. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.